If you could take your seats, please. I'd like to call to order the Committee of the Whole this evening, Tuesday, January 25th, 2011. If we could take a roll call, please.
Ms. Casey?
Here.
Mr. Charleston?
Here.
Mrs. Charlton?
Here.
Mrs. Hancock?
Here.
Mrs. Lubeck?
Here.
Mr. Price?
Here.
Mrs. Thomas?
Here. If we could stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So we are having this meeting at 6:30 and our regular meeting at 7 o'clock. Are there any public comments at this time about this topic? No? Okay, then we'll have the PMA presentation, please.
Tonight, I'd like to introduce Howie Krause, Vice President of Financial Planning Services from PMA.
Thank you, Kim. Filling in for Mike Francis, who usually is appearing before this board. We're at a very busy time, as you are, and I volunteered to come back to Westmont. I grew up at 79th and Cass and used to ride my bicycle in to play baseball over behind Holy Trinity and go to Stop and Chat. And so it was fun to come back this evening. I want to talk about the financial projection model for Westmont. And I think just as a quick update, probably not so much for the board as it is for the audience, but just talking about where the projection model comes from. We're looking to try to create a comprehensive model that can demonstrate with some great sensitivity to the variables that go into looking ahead at the financial condition of the district over a period of 5 years. I would say, too, that with the number of variables that go into the model, most of which you cannot control, particularly on the revenue side, the end result over 5 years is much more likely to occur in year 1 and year 2 than it is to occur in year 3, 4, and 5. What we're looking for is how do you see where the future might be and what changes do you need to make to your financial planning to either achieve a goal or keep from achieving some other outcome. So using it for budget planning, for trend analysis to help set fiscal policies, and then we have annual updates, as you're quite well aware, and the scenario analysis. It's that power of looking at, if we change this variable, what's the outcome look like that comes into play. We use your annual financial reports from the last 5 years as a way of understanding and putting some historical context to the district, but the FY11 budget is the basis for the projections. So we're moving everything forward off of assumptions based on where we are with the FY11 budget. We look at your historical tax extensions as much for trend analysis as for anything else, but then laying that against the context of what's going on in the larger world. Certainly we're in a financial condition nationally and especially locally where growth has stopped largely. New construction is down significantly, and we're seeing different trends in student populations. We look at your assessed valuations, particularly as you're moving forward and projecting out what your extension will be for FY12. We now know what the CPI is after that came out about a week and a half ago, which will impact your levy a year from now for the fiscal year 13. You have a contract and scattergram. In the context for Westmont tonight, it's difficult while you're in negotiations, and we'll talk about how we put placeholders in for that contract looking into the future. Salary and benefit trend information, your enrollment projections, and student staffing ratios. We look at your operating budget right now for FY11, revenues of approximately $23.5 million. The largest portion of those are property taxes, local resources. At 80%, you are considered, this will probably be somewhat of a surprise, but you're considered by state standards to be a relatively wealthy community. because you have resources that are in the upper portion of all districts in Illinois when you divide the amount of local resources you have from property taxes by the number of students who attend every day. That does not ease the pain sometimes of trying to balance a budget. It's simply from the state perspective where you are. Other local resources, about 7.2%. You'll note there that general state aid is only 2.8% of all of your revenues. That's an indicator of how the state views the district as being relatively wealthy and having more resources than most of the districts in the state. Other state resources are 4.9%, your categorical payments for the kinds of programs for which the state allocates money, and that's the money that the state has been behind for the last couple of years, or categorical payments. That's about 5%. You'll note the federal money at 4.8%. That money was probably a little higher over the last 2 years. It's down some as the ERA money, for the most part, has been used up, but we have Education Jobs Fund bill money that came in this year. All of that will go away, and your federal money will be reduced slightly from that 4.8% as we look into the future.
Howie, if you could just
Please.
touch on the nature of just top 4 or 5 items and what other local, because 7.2% may be just a question in some people's mind.
Certainly.
What's that money?
That would typically be things like textbook fees, building rentals, fees for extracurricular activities.
Interest income.
Interest income, which is a very small part, I'm afraid, right now, but yes. So those other things that are, those other dollars that are generated at the local level that are not tied to property taxes. If you had developers' contributions that were still in your operation and maintenance fund, that kind of thing would also be in there. Consumer Price Index as a tax cap district, this is one of the most critical factors, and with less and less new construction going on, it becomes the dominant factor for how much additional new revenue you will get from year to year from local property taxes. Over the last few years, we've seen it at 3.4% in the beginning of this sequence in 2006. 4.1% is the highest CPI we've had since the tax cap came in. The 0.1 that governed this year's levy, this year's extension, if you will, 0.1% was the lowest CPI we've had since the inception of the tax cap. We had a 2.7% CPI during calendar year 9, and then the new one that just came out from calendar year 10, the 1.5%. We're projecting that the CPI will go back to a near historical average over 10 years, over 15 years, over 20 years of about 2.5%. But that obviously is one of those that you have no control over. We saw it, in fact, jump about 2.5 hundredths or tenths of a percent in December as gasoline prices spiked. We were running about 1.3% through November, and then it jumped up.
Howie?
Yes?
How conservative is the 2.5 number?
Knowing that it is moving around far more than it has, and the 2.5 in the out years is probably relatively conservative. There are two schools of thought in the near term. One is that we're still inching out of recovery, and so CPI, the cost of living, is not increasing very rapidly. There's another school of thought, of course, where that at some point here in the near future, we're going to lose control and inflation may start to run rampant. What we did look at was what would happen, as you'll see a little bit later, what would happen if that CPI were moving in one direction or another, and a 1% change would be about $200,000, I think it is.
Out of curiosity, you work with a lot of other school districts.
We do.
Is 2.5 at the high end of the range that other districts use, at the low end, in the middle? What's your experience with other districts?
Most districts will use the 2.5 for lack of a better way of projecting, especially in years 2 through 5. Year 1, we're seeing anywhere from people, earlier in the year, their projections were at 1%. Now they're up to 2.5. Most of the districts will be between 1.5 and 2.5
So
projections for next year.
Any number of districts are in fact using 1.5 and 2 as opposed to 2.5.
We're still completing, I would say that probably about 40% of our districts are right now using less than 2.5%.
Good, thank you.
New growth, the history of the district, we've had new construction as high as 18.6 million, but as you can see over the last few years, that's dropped significantly. The projection for the upcoming extension is $3.5 million of new construction, but recognizing we're still in a slowdown, that we've projected down at 2 million, then back to 3 and staying there before it hopefully starts to recover out there in levy years 14, 15, and 16.
This is 2 million in EAV construction, right?
Correct.
So EAV, vis-a-vis market value is about a third. So if we say that there's 3.5 million next year in our district, within our boundaries, what we're really saying is somewhere in our boundaries, there must be $10 million of new construction.
Correct. Now, those would have been properties that came on the tax roll
Last year.
by last January 1st. So it's and for a district probably like yours where there's been some tear downs and some, reconstruction, some new construction of new homes, it's largely probably going to be those homes that were occupied late in 2009 that were in process that are now coming on the rolls.
And the same question as the last slide, regards to how many districts are using this type of number. Are we in the middle? Are we at the bottom? Are we at the top? I mean, it seems like a dartboard on this one again also.
And trying to focus on what you think are comparative districts, an infill district without a lot of dirt going on around it.
This would be relatively the same as districts in a landlocked situation like you would be, where we're seeing new construction cut by 2/3, 3/4. The most conservative number would be there would be no new construction. That's not likely to happen, but your range probably is in that 1 to 3 million. So the 2, I think, is given what is happening across our other districts like yours, that'd be appropriate.
And Dan, right now, the 2010 is projected based off of information we got
From the assessor.
From the assessor.
Yeah, I understand.
So we don't know what that is, and again, it's one of those things,
No.
after we see what that is.
Yeah, the real trick is
Yeah.
11, 12, and 13, in my opinion, if only because other than some commercial activity, which may be a net zero when you consider lost EAV
Right.
against new EAV, there's effectively no new construction in the residential sector. There's just none, because that would have been houses that started constructing in '09 when banks just got TARP money and were effectively shut off.
And I would think that, not knowing specifically, but if in fact the new construction is largely centered on larger houses, whether tear downs or new construction of larger houses, that's the market that has fairly much dried up. So where 10 houses may have gotten you the 10 million, in some cases, you won't see those 10 houses going forward.
And the other thing, $1 million change either way in new value is $35,000 adjustment in revenue. So, again,
Yeah.
All things to be aware of, but, kind of moving targets in this environment right now.
Some other revenue assumptions: the corporate personal property replacement tax is projected to stay at $275,000 annually. That has also fluctuated significantly over the last couple of years. Hopefully, as we move out of recession in Illinois, that will stabilize or increase. Investment income, we're projecting the 25 basis point rate of return for FY12 and then 25 basis point increase each succeeding year, a far cry from not too long ago when interest rates were in the 4s and 5%. All other local revenues are projected at current levels. General state aid, as you are having somewhat declining enrollment, and even with the increases the small increases that you're seeing in your local EAV, you're going to move into a new category of state funding for general state aid. You're in what's called an alternate formula now, in which you still get some additional money from the state. We're projecting, based on those other factors, ADA and your EAV, that you will move into the flat grant formula in 2014, fiscal year 14, which means you'll go back to where you get $218 per student in general state aid, and that's it. You would still collect categorical money, but your general state aid will drop significantly, as you'll see soon. Other state categoricals projected at current FY11 full appropriation. We are not overly optimistic after the income tax increase, but we are, I think, collectively, the districts that we work with are relatively optimistic that we will get the money that we're due. We may not see any additional money, but we'll get the money that we're due over a period of time. And then that appropriation would stay flat. Federal money, we talked about the ERA money and Federal Education Jobs Fund money coming off of your revenues with no other increases in federal money projected. So here's your general state aid. Looking at this in thousands, you'll see that this year about $655,000 in general state aid, moving upwards to $755,000 before we roll into that flat grant category, and you'll come back down to $611,000, and then that will decrease slightly as your enrollment decreases. Here's the sensitivity analysis that we've touched on. 1% change in CPI is about $200,000 of additional or lesser revenue, and new property $1 million plus or minus $35,000.
And that's new, that's EAV, 1 million EAV?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Operating expense, your budget of $24 million, almost $500,000. Clearly, the two largest categories are salaries and benefits. About 73% of all of your expenditures are salary and benefits. You'll see purchase services there, probably transportation, I would suspect, some contract out. Supplies and materials, only 7.4% across all of your operating funds, which includes educational fund, operation and maintenance, transportation, IMRF, and your tort funds. Your capital outlay is very small, 1.2%. Other objects includes tuition charges at 7.6%. Non-capitalized equipment, things that are not very expensive, is at 0. There's just a small slice there. I think the critical thing there is to understand that by the time you take, if you take away the salary and benefits, and you take away things like utilities, gasoline for transportation, some of the food service costs, the amount of money that's really at your, if you will, controllable.
Discretionary.
Discretionary, there's the word, thanks. Discretionary is very, very small percentage of your entire budget. So the largest expenditures are where most of your discussion will undoubtedly focus. Without a contract in place, we have to put a placeholder in. So we've addressed that. We would not want this to be seen as any part of negotiations, but rather what do we do to look at the projections for salary, for benefits, and the overall picture moving forward. And if you will, this is probably a best case kind of scenario. Additional expenditures for salary or for benefits will simply make your picture look worse. So we've, as you can see, no increase in FY12, no base increase in 13 plus step, 14, 15, 16, 2% base plus step. For your other staff, similar, no increase in FY12, 1.5%, and then 2%. Health and dental benefits. Districts that are relatively small, like yours, are seeing larger projected health premium increases. We had about 50 districts this morning that we were talking to, and it's the smaller districts that are seeing their insurance brokers talking about double-digit, 10 to 15% increases right now in health benefits as the very real possibility. It's our belief that the insurance companies are still hedging their bets, if you will, until the actual impact of the health care bill is better known, and the smaller districts are getting a little bit larger increases. The other expenditures, education fund, purchase services, supplies, capital outlay at 2.5%, special ed, as you saw in that other objects, an 8% annual increase projected. O&M fund, 2.5% for everything, but no increase in capital outlay. What you have in your current budget is what is projected moving forward for any and all major expenditures for your buildings. A 3.5% increase in your transportation fund, and then we're taking out those expenses that were tied to the federal money that's gone after FY11. Staffing, we have projected staffing at a flat level for the 5 years, moving forward from the 120.6 FTE you currently have. There are some additional assumptions that there are no significant changes to school funding. I think at this point that seems reasonable. There are no changes to the property tax cap. That certainly will not occur. There will be no changes to the property tax cap legislation. We include known and estimated retirements, as teachers in particular are retiring. With your contract, teachers are going out, and their most experienced teachers with the most salary will be going out, let's say, at a $90,000 level. We're replacing those teachers at an average salary of $58,831, which is the equivalent of your master's degree, step 5. And we use that simply as an average. It would be unrealistic to think that every new teacher that you would hire as a replacement would come in with no experience and just a bachelor's, because you have some positions where it's important that you maintain either an advanced degree is required or you want the experience moving forward. And again, your FY11 budget is the basis for the projections. We bring this to a table form. And a little bit difficult to see from the audience. The trends there, you can see the local revenue increasing, as we've said, at effectively the CPI rate. The federal money going down, state money going down as we move forward when you move into that flat grant category. And then when we look at expenditures, you see that the expenditures are increasing and the percentage is increasing over a period of time, and that reflects back to those basic assumptions on what to do to cost out salary schedules. So you are looking at a projected deficit this year of approximately $1 million. That $1 million grows slightly in 12 and 13, and then as the expenditures accelerate beyond that, that deficit starts to grow, and your fund balance starts to diminish from about $11 million projected at the, or $10 million, $11 million projected at the end of this year, down to a projected fund balance of about $3.6 million in 2016.
And Howie, to be clear, in terms of the last 3 years and expenditure growth in the last 3 years, you just mentioned 74% or something like that of our budget is salaries and benefits.
Yes.
And obviously the assumption back on page 12 of your PowerPoint used those last 3 years at 2% increases on base plus steps.
And that's what's accelerating.
That's what's accelerating in terms of this projection.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
So if we bring this back, those of you who've seen the presentations before know that we try to incorporate everything into one place. The red line at the top of the graph is your historical and projected ending fund balances on June 30th for your operating funds. And you can see that it spiked there at the end of 2009, it dropped some in 10, and it is slowly going down over 11, 12, and then accelerating as we get to 14, 15, and 16. It's not so much when you get out to the 13, 14, 15, 16, the specific dollars, but rather what's the trajectory, if you will, of the line. that you're trying to adjust as you're moving forward. As you see in the blue line, that's an estimate of what your low fund balance is during the course of the year. As a DuPage County district, that is typically right at the end of May or early June before the first distribution of property taxes are collected and distributed. You have about an $8 million gap between your ending fund balance and your low fund balance each of those years, approximately equivalent to the amount of money you get in that first distribution. But as you see in that blue line, by 2013, you just barely have enough money to not borrow in our projections, and it's an estimate, which means it could go either way. But by the time you get to 2014, you're into a tax anticipation warrant mode where you need to borrow money to meet your obligations for salaries and for your payroll runs and so forth.
So to be clear, on that, let's talk about the low balance numbers for a moment. 2011 low balance number is $2,783,000. So that would be May of 11.
Correct.
That's May of this year.
Yes.
So, just based on the projection from there, and that's our budget. Then next year we would go down to $1,537,000. That would be at the end of 12 or May of 12.
Yes.
And then 2013 we're effectively at zero or $237,000. But there's enough fluff in here to get you in big trouble one way or the other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where you're really watching the pennies in your treasurer's reports to see are we in danger of needing money to meet our accounts payable run or our payroll run during the latter part of May.
So we don't, I think broadly stated, safe to say that we don't feel like we're going to have to borrow money this year or next, but lacking change or lacking changes in things that matter in terms of the assumptions, if we continue on the path, then 3 years from now, we clearly are in a position where we have to borrow money.
And the only caveat I would add to that is that with
negotiations
in process, that number in 12 in particular could fluctuate up or down.
And this is, again, if we don't make any changes.
That's right.
If we, as a board and district, don't make any changes.
Well, to
But
the
if we
staffing,
do-
to our staffing and to
Right,
particular
that's what I'm talking about. If we chose, if we don't do anything.
Yes.
This is where we'd be.
Yes. If all of those assumptions came true,
Right.
that's what we would anticipate.
If we get to a tax anticipation warrant position, what's the cost of money? I mean, what does it cost us to borrow that money?
It's
Depends on what the interest rate is at that point in time, plus there's issuance cost, legal fees, and it's a time-consuming process.
It's a rather short term.
Right.
Typically, you might, if, for example, in 13 you ended up having to borrow rather than not having enough money, it would be, we borrow at the beginning of May and pay it back probably by June 30th. But as that number gets bigger, you're further back in the cycle and you're borrowing it for longer, and then your interest costs go
Is it
up.
generally a spread to LIBOR because it's short term?
I believe so. But
You don't.
that wouldn't be
Plus-
my area.
Plus fees and time and
Yeah, well,
everything else
particularly
tacked on top.
particularly the first time.
Right.
And really LIBOR, you think?
I think so.
In this
but-
day and age, we're still
Well,
tied to LIBOR?
because it's fairly short term, it's.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Any further questions?
Well, and then this is just taking into consideration the day-to-day operations, correct? It's not doing anything for our facilities?
No, this doesn't have the
Capital projects.
facilities, any capital projects in it. It's just your operating funds.
So we are going to have to look at our budget, as we're doing.
I don't think any district looking at that picture, I would say this picture is not as bad as many other districts. There are many that are better, you're kind of in the middle, but the assumptions on the expenditure side, given where you are with contract negotiations, are very conservative. I mean, they're low additional expense built in here for that contract negotiations.
Right, and one of the things that we did in this was kind of the best case scenario, if those salaries were at zero, so everyone understands what a zero means. A zero means we still have $1 million deficit. So if we put additional on, then we go to 1.2, 1.3, $1.4 million, you know, whatever. But this is kind of, because a lot of times you try and do, here's worst case scenario. So we did it just a little bit differently for people to have a different perspective on this. This is best case if everybody in the district is taking zeros for next year, and some of our employees have already taken zeros this year. So we want everybody to be cognizant of that and what that looks like, and what any additional increases to salary mean in terms of cuts that the board may have to make.
And do we have a dollar amount associated with each % of increase in salary?
I do for different categories.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Our pleasure.
Are there any other questions at this time? Okay, then at this point, the chair will entertain a motion to adjourn this committee of the whole.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, and we're going to take a 2-minute break in between.